First of all, my name is Schmidt-Hens. I'm the director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies here at UW, at the University of Washington. And we are very happy and thank you for coming to listen to Dr. Vindman's talk titled The Failure of Geopolitical Realism and the Promise of New Idealism. This is the annual Ellison Lecture, commemorating or celebrating the work of Herbert J. Ellison, a professor in the Jackson School, a former director, a teacher, a researcher, a colleague for some of us in this room, also a policy advisor in Washington, D.C., a giant here on campus, and we remember him and set him as our ideal for what we want to accomplish here at the University of Washington. I will tell you a little bit about today's event and then move on very quickly. We have about an hour's program that's pretty structured into 4 segments. Dr. Vindman will speak for about 15 minutes. And then one by one, there will be 3 University of Washington faculty members, Professors Scott Radnitz, Danny Bessner, and Laada Bilaniuk, who will have a dialogue with Dr. Vindman. And after that, we will open up for audience questions and answers. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander Vindman, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. He was the Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council. Before that, he served as the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia, for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as attaché at the U.S. embassies in Moscow and Kyiv. While on Joint Staff, he authored the National Military Strategy for Russia. He earned a master's from Harvard University, where he served as a Hauser leader, and a master's and doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, where he's a senior fellow. Dr. Vindman leads the national security think tank Institute for Informed American Leadership. He's the president of the nonprofit Here Right Matters Foundation, an executive board member for the Renew Democracy Initiative, a senior fellow at the Kettering Foundation, and a senior advisor to Vote Vets. Dr. Vindman is the author of the Why It Matters Substack and the New York Times best-selling books, Here Right Matters and The Folly of Realism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexander Vindman for his talk on failure of geopolitical realism and the promise of new idealism. Thank you.
So, my background really is as a practitioner. This book that is my second book was a revision of my doctoral dissertation, which I completed in December 2022, about a year into the full-scale war. So the project relies on a wealth of experience. The methodology centered around a large number of interviews with top policymakers, really from presidents on down on the U.S. and Ukrainian side. The Russians didn't really have much access to, but I had firsthand experience working with the Russians. So I think it's important to start, because it's grounded in my experiences, with a little bit more background. My career, a 22-year military career, half of that was as a troop leader. The second half was as a diplomat, serving in U.S. embassies in Ukraine, in Russia. The Pentagon was as a political military advisor, basically a kind of a strategist and a planner for my area of expertise, which was Russia and Eastern Europe. And then on the National Security Council as a director, which is a pretty significant position. As a director, you chair meetings with deputy assistant secretaries. So it's the lowest level at the highest level of policy making, where you're bringing together the entirety of government. For those of you that remember some recent history, I was forced out of government after reporting Donald Trump's corruption, where he tried to put pressure on the Ukrainians to deliver an investigation into his rival, Joe Biden. And on the back of that, I was looking for something to do, and I've always had a passion for continued education, and decided that I wanted to figure out why this relationship between Russia and Ukraine was what it was, and what role the West, the most powerful alliance, NATO, had in either arresting or accelerating some of it. And wasn't necessarily preconceived with blaming any particular party, but I wanted to understand, no longer as a practitioner, but from a kind of an analytical study, the circumstances to full-scale war. The fundamental theory, and I saw it firsthand, is that the U.S. and Europe granted Ukraine a notable space in our relationships, but granted Russia an exceptional space in our relationships. And if you think back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, a greatly diminished Russia, still the largest country in the world, but greatly diminished based on elements of power, such as economic power, or the military greatly reduced, the size of the population greatly reduced, still inherited all the artifacts of great power status, whether it's a role in the UN Security Council, a singular place with regards to the way we interacted on various kinds of negotiations. So there was no doubt in my mind that Russia has started from a place of great exceptionalism. Russia is a very, very good advocate for itself, making the case on why it should be treated uniquely. And certainly with regards to its nuclear arsenal, the one area where it is a peer or a near peer, it might warrant that kind of consideration, but in a lot of other ways it didn't. So as I started to look through the different turning points in our relationship, whether it's independence, in 1991 we started with a place where the Soviet Union unraveled in a large part because of the fact that that Ukraine voted overwhelmingly. 90% of the population of Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union. One of the sources of pain for Vladimir Putin, which he describes the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, and Ukraine is central and instrumental to that collapse. And what was the posture of the U.S.? So I started looking at that moment. I looked at denuclearization, which was a period of keen interaction between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. The Orange Revolution, Ukraine's first revolution in 2004, the Georgia War, which was Russia shifting from coercion and hybrid warfare to outright military aggression in its backyard, and then to full-scale aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. And the pattern started to become pretty clear to me. It became a pattern of, first of all, buying into Russia's sense of exceptionalism, but also misplaced hopes and fears on what you could accomplish with Russia. In 1991, for instance, we put a lot of stock into, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, we put a lot of stock into preserving the role of Gorbachev, because he was a great reformer. He was taking the Soviet Union on a unique path. And when the Ukrainians voiced their desires for a sovereign, independent state, we counseled them against it. One of these infamous moments was the Chicken Kiev speech, where George H.W. Bush travels to Ukraine in July of 1991 and tells the Ukrainians in their parliament that they shouldn't rush into something that they've been striving for hundreds of years, in fact, and that they should maybe figure out how to reconcile and be subordinate to Moscow and remain part of the empire. And that was an idea of preserving a relationship with an emerging dangerous world, Russia, the Soviet Union fracturing and maintaining a massive arsenal, and wanting to avoid this idea of multiple states emerging out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, including nuclear states. So reducing the possibility for nuclear proliferation, but also avoiding the idea of a Yugoslavia scenario. So Yugoslavia, we still see it today with the Balkan states and lots of ethnic conflicts, but a scenario with nuclear weapons. And that was the driving force in that period of time. So one deeply driven by fears. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a pivot towards hopes and the fact that Russia could be dragged into or enticed or invited into the community of nations and be a contributing member of the democratic world. And in that moment, we were willing to put pressure on the Ukrainians initially to give up their nuclear weapons, to give them to the Russians. And the Ukrainians were not interested in compromising their sovereignty without some clarity on security and some benefits from participating in these negotiations. And we pivoted from a combination of initially from coercion alongside Russia to get Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons to some enticements. We offered them some security assurances, nothing ironclad, but something that at least put them at ease in a moment where they couldn't necessarily maintain a nuclear arsenal. The costs were too high, and maintaining a nuclear arsenal would make them a pariah. So we pivoted between coercion to some enticement. But this is the pattern that plays out over the course of all these different critical junctures. One of the most infamous and notorious moments of misplaced hopes around Russia was the famous meeting between George Bush and Putin at Bush's Crawford Ranch, in which, to paraphrase, he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. And that was it wasn't entirely idealistic. It was also this idea that somehow the Russians could play a constructive role in fighting the global war on terror in the aftermath of 9/11. Putin was the first person to call Bush and offer condolences and offer support, and that was something that really was enticing. So the idea that we could potentially have a functional relationship with Russia didn't play out that well, because a decade later, or a little more than a decade later, Russia was putting bounties on U.S. troops in Afghanistan. But this theme of misplaced hopes and fears was a consistent component of our relationship. So much so that it didn't just affect our willingness to work with Russia, it also moderated and depressed our ability to work with other countries in the region, like Ukraine. Certainly in the aftermath of the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Ukraine and the ushering in of a distinctly pro-Russian president, Viktor Yushchenko, we had an opportunity to work very, very closely with the Ukrainians. We had the ability to help shepherd the Ukrainians' desires to enter the prosperity and enjoy the democratic world, and instead we were cautious because we didn't want to upset our ability to work with Russia. So this particular idea of hopes and fears played out repeatedly throughout the period, and it was not just one particular party or one president that succumbed to these different urgencies. It was consistently both parties seemed to make this mistake. And in the early days, we had a deep sense of expertise about this region, about these countries, more so on Russia. Ukraine was never really considered its own state. We had an opportunity, we lost that credibility and lost that expertise very, very quickly in the peace dividend, where we moved on. We moved to the end of history and no threats from Russia, and lost that kind of expertise. So, it's one of the privileges of being able to talk to students, because you're the future cohort that's going to help us navigate some of these difficult challenges going forward. We're very much underinvesting in Ukraine, but at least we're making an effort to move in that direction to better understand the region. So that the consistency is shocking, even through 2014, where when Russia invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea and the Donbass, we were quite forgiving, relatively modest sanctions on Russia, and didn't quite reset like we had done on previous occasions, whether that was in 2008 after the Georgia War, or 2004 after the Orange Revolution 2005. We did try to figure out how we could continue to maintain a relationship with a country that had again, over the course of a relatively short period of time, graduated from coercion to hybrid warfare, interfering in elections, to outright military aggression. As an example of this ultimate these mistakes that we were making, even under President Biden, where I think we had a better appraisal and less wishful thinking about the ability to reconcile with Russia, we still were deeply arrested in our ability to support Ukraine in a robust manner. In the early days, on the premise that we might be the driving factor behind Russian aggression, that we might be the impetus for the security dilemma and that precipitates Russia's full-scale war. And then in the aftermath of the full-scale war starting in February 2022, that somehow our support for Ukraine and Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty and frankly its defense of the flank of Europe, our most important security alliance through NATO and our most important economic relationship, that we could be driving towards a direct confrontation with Russia. Deeply misplaced on the premise that the Russians had any interest whatsoever in a direct confrontation. They didn't, and that was proven over the course of many months and years, but to the detriment of being able to help the Ukrainians in the early days when Russia was off balance and there was still some potential for the war to kind of wind down. Now we're approaching a fourth year war, and we have our seventh administration, and the ultimate folly of realism is, for those of you that are political science students, this will be too simplistic a definition, but realism fundamentally is an argument about states pursuing their interests and pursuing their interests maximally. And in that kind of situation, you start to hyper-focus on transactional relationship. What can you achieve from policy wins? Now, you're not focused on the long term, what is a vital national security interest. So you have a Donald Trump that is the ultimate folly of realism, where he doesn't fully understand. Well, he doesn't care to understand the history around the relationships, the alliances, the historical bedrocks of our strength, as well as the challenges we've had from different corners of the world, and we repeat or amplify the mistakes of the past. So, in a condition where we're approaching a fourth year of war, and Russia is strained, its economy is stretched, it's really done as much as it could to mitigate the various shocks of 4 years of war, sanctions, enormous expenditures on the military at the expense of sustaining an economy. In that kind of scenario, where we could potentially aid the conclusion of this war, we have to give it another go with regards to deeply misplaced ideas about collaborating with Russia, figuring out if there's an economic relationship with Russia, not even understanding that Russia is an adversary and a source of instability, and that our role would be to protect NATO, where we have an obligation to defend NATO, a collective defense organization, and in so doing support Ukraine so we never have to face that kind of challenge. So that's the ultimate folly of realism. The subtitle, to a certain extent, explains why I'm out here about 9 months down the road, how the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. This will be a topic that we'll be discussing probably this time next year, because there's little prospect that we'll have completely exited this war. More than likely, if in a maybe optimistic scenario, we could be in a negotiating phase, but still quite challenging, maybe something akin to the hostilities, some level of violence that occurred in 2014-15 is mainly a best case scenario, but we won't be out of this war because we keep repeating the same mistakes of the past. Let's see. I think that covers the general thesis. Yeah. So I think the fundamental premise was to understand how we seem to repeat the same pattern over and over. The second part of the book is really casting a different approach, something called neo-idealism. It's the idea of values primacy, the idea that in order to, as a very practical and pragmatic, not ideological or idealistic approach, which sometimes, the idea that it's neo-idealism, it's a hard thing to argue against, but the simple idea is that we have been too short-sighted, too transactional, and if we focus on values primacy, if we focus on the things that really are important to the U.S., like the bedrock of our security relationships with NATO, and if we focus on the sources of our economic prosperity, that could allow us to navigate past some of these short-term transactions that have distracted us, deflected us from demonstrating resolve to either push back on Russia, support our allies, be more conditional. And I think this is widely applicable not just to the Russia-Ukraine scenario, but frankly, the way we conduct ourselves with regards to Ukraine, the way we conduct ourselves with regards to China and other great powers, where we also buy into some sense of exceptionalism. We also succumb to consistent misplaced hopes and fears, maybe even less appropriate than in Russia, because in the 90s, maybe there was a post-history moment where the Soviet Union collapsed and that there was an opportunity to bring Russia into the West. China, we never really had that. In that same time frame, we had the Tiananmen Square massacres and very little to drive some optimism, except for this theory of economic prosperity resulting in transformation. You hit a certain threshold with regards to per capita household income, and then you magically transform. So we need to do better about figuring out how to not be distracted and succumb to misplaced hopes and fears. So I think with that, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here and for the presentation. Your book was thought-provoking. It also provoked a lot of words, so I don't have that much time, and I'll just get right to the point. I see your book as a specific rebuke of U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine, and also a general prescription for how U.S. policy should be. The book is a comprehensive study about American policy toward Ukraine. You make a very strong argument that the U.S. has tended to overlook Ukraine and its interests and has always been treated as secondary to managing relations with Russia. You argue, I think, persuasively that the U.S. has a big country bias, but also a bias toward paying attention to unstable nuclear armed states. It's clear from your book and from just following the news that Russia has sought to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. Russia was not allowed to join the West. To achieve its goals, Russia interfered in Ukrainian politics numerous times, supporting pro-Russian leaders, manipulating its elections, sometimes poisoning its opposition leaders. After trying softer methods that seemed not to dissuade Ukraine from trying to join the West, it then escalated to harder ones. And the full-scale invasion in 2022 can be seen as a way of punishing Ukraine for daring to try to leave Russia's orbit. So the book, I think, highlights very well how the U.S. has botched its policy toward Russia, how the Bush administration misunderstood Putin in his early years, was maybe overly naive about the prospects for democratic change in Russia, and was generally overly solicitous to Russia's reactions, including playing down its bad behavior when it comes to things like meddling in Ukraine's elections or invading Georgia, for example. But the book also overlooks some actions that the U.S. took that were perceived in Russia as provocative or disrespectful. The administrations over the years underestimated how a lot of its own actions would be viewed in Russia, among them the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration's withdrawal from the ABM treaty, the NATO Bucharest summit in which Georgia and Ukraine were promised future NATO membership, the recognition of Kosovo, the NATO bombing of Libya, and a bunch of other things that Putin himself often mentions ad nauseum. But these policies also had critics in the United States too. And just because Putin was against them doesn't mean they were necessarily wise policies. In the book, you also use Russia and Ukraine as a test case for neo-idealism, the policy that you think would be a better alternative to what's been done. So you, as you mentioned earlier when we talked, You had to cut down some of the more boring stuff from your dissertation. So this book is mercifully lacking in methodology and theory, which makes it very readable. But then this gives us an opportunity to talk more about what neo-idealism would look like in practice. So I found a few places where you talk about what that would look like. Toward the end of the book, you say that neo-idealism would involve the United States working to harden, develop democracies, encourage developing and struggling democracies, and nurturing democratic values. Arguably, this already is US policy. Values are part of American policy, just not always the highest priority. The Freedom Support Act of 1992 led to the disbursement of tens of billions of dollars to post-Soviet countries, and yet the region now is less democratic than it was in the 1990s. From the research that I could find, about $3 billion was provided to Ukraine before 2022, and that has had mixed results on Ukrainian democracy. So we're all for democracy, but we, the United States, is not very good at spreading it, and sometimes practicing it. So given the failure of American democratic assistance over the years, you could argue that we've even placed too much emphasis on democracy assistance, because changing the policies of a country, even small ones, is very hard. Has the US, in fact, ever succeeded in practicing an idealistic set of policies in a way that meaningfully affected the direction of a country that we're trying to influence? And then the second aspect of a neo-idealistic policy is an approach toward non-democratic countries. So here also toward the end of the book, you say we should work with emerging and struggling democracies that share our values, not with authoritarian regimes unlikely to reconcile their worldview to ours. And you also say the US should not meet with China just for the sake of meeting. Okay, but why? Is it because we can't convert these countries, or it's because we shouldn't compromise our values, and then our example of not compromising will maybe inspire others? How is that supposed to work? What values does idealism encompass? Democracy, human rights, gender rights, minority rights, LGBTQ rights, social welfare policies, policies about climate change. All of these things have been emphasized at one time or another by various administrations. I think the Obama administration under Secretary Clinton pushed very hard on gender rights and LGBT rights. But what happens if we disagree with another country on some of these issues, but not other? What is the threshold by which we determine a country is more like an ally than an adversary? And at the risk of being perceived as overly realist, there is an argument sometimes for grubby compromises to achieve practical goals. For example, trade with non-democratic countries has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. India has elections, but the government abuses minorities. China is autocratic, but it's a leading producer of solar panels and has critical minerals for batteries that the United States needs in order to move toward a greener economy. Even Russia was integral to the deal with Iran to pause its nuclear program. And then in terms of long-term strategy, what does new idealism promise when it comes to how the world might look in the long term? So what if we're okay with maintaining this firewall? What are the implications globally if we refuse to talk to countries that we don't like? So returning to the theme of the book, is new idealism a policy that will apply to everybody, or does it work really only for Russia, an easy case of a country that does not share our values, or at least doesn't seem to be? And what about countries that maybe abuse their own citizens but don't invade other countries? Again, Russia may be an easy case because it seems to be bad on both counts. And then finally, I'm going to mention a period of American policy where it looks like an administration took a neo-idealistic approach, and that is the Bush administration in the second term. And we might take this moment to note that Dick Cheney, late great Dick Cheney, died yesterday, and so this is a reminder of the world in, say, 2004 to 2008, when the administration pursued what I call the Freedom Agenda, and also took a very tough posture toward Russia. Cheney famously said, "We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it." That sounds pretty neo-idealist to me. How did that set of policies look in practice? Well, in 2006, Cheney accused Russia of using oil and gas as tools of intimidation and blackmail against its neighbors. The Bush administration actively encouraged the development of export routes for Central Asian and Caspian energy that would bypass Russia. So a very aggressive energy policy in order to help wean countries off of dependence on Russia. The Bush administration openly criticized anti-democratic actions in Russia and aggressively pursued NATO enlargement over Russian objections. At the same time, the administration also worked to promote democratic values, again, implementing the principles of expanding freedom. But in fact, it did actually put its money where its mouth was by increasing funding for democracy and government programs, massively increasing the budget of the National Endowment for Democracy. The administration created the Millennium Challenge account, which tied assistance to countries that were premised on good governance, investing in their citizens, and respecting economic freedom. The US also provided institutional support around the world for democratic elections and the rule of law, most prominently in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the administration openly embraced the color revolutions, right, as a sign of expanding freedom that it wholeheartedly supported, at least vocally. So you kind of dismissed the Bush administration, you criticized them for being overly solicitous toward Russia, and yet it does seem like the embodiment of a new idealist foreign policy as you describe it. Okay, so to wrap up, I think Russia's behavior recently has certainly vindicated criticism of American and also European policy over the last 30 years. Ukraine is now fighting for its life, and one way to look at this war is as a proxy battle over the future of democracy. At the same time, struggles against authoritarianism are also happening within countries, even ones very close to home. So if values are going to make a comeback, perhaps this is the time, and it's good to be on the right side of history. And I think we have only a few minutes.
All right. So I'll see how many of this I can get through. So I think you hit actually, I think about this as a practitioner, and I think about like the heuristics that allow me to navigate some of these challenges. So, this methodology of, there's two I'll point out. One is where we want to apply our resources. We want to harden struggling democracies. We might be considered one of those at the moment. But under normal circumstances, we want to be able to cooperate with our fellow allies on the issues that we have around foreign actors, state actors, with regards to disinformation and the platforms that they use to advance those kinds of attacks to fracture our societies. I think about the fact that we want to support developing democracies. And then I think about the fact that, and this also addresses, what we do in cases in which the world is realist, and there are a lot of proponents for realism, and we have a lot of regimes that operate from a realist perspective, realist worldview. So in there, we may need to interact with the states, but we continue to advocate and support values-based institutions. So, without necessarily triggering attacks on the non-governmental organizations in China or different corners of the world, we have U.S. aid that supports these kinds of institutions under normal circumstances. And of course, this book was written before the Trump administration and these institutions were eliminated. I think they're vital components of U.S. soft power. The other heuristic that's important to me as a practitioner is a basic notion of calculating where we may need to compromise on our values. So the neo-idealist precept is values primacy, so values first. That's what allows you to potentially look towards long-term targets. Look towards long-term targets and bypass these short-term transactional wins, whether it's an economic deal, this idea of working with Russia on climate change when they're really never quite interested in it. And the formula for me is something along the lines of understanding what the stake is, relative stake. Do we have a stake in a particular region? Where is that compared to our adversary? The resources that we could apply. We might be able to apply resources in corners of the world where we have access and basing and influence, but If it's in Central Asia, that makes it much, much more harder to allocate resources to solve problems. And then the risk, both the risk of action and inaction. So these are, to me, practical heuristics that I've applied to different issues that I've had to deal with. I wasn't in a position where I could advocate for neo-idealism in my roles. Some of them were senior, some of them were junior, but this is the way I try to figure out, what we could do in a particular scenario. A couple of other ideas, I think, that to try to address some of your points. There's a Assistant Secretary of State, Wes Mitchell, if that name rings a bell, a pretty thoughtful individual. I think you'd certainly fall in more in the realist camp. And I remember a conversation around the notion of a country that is singular in focus on values to the exclusion of interests, or interest to the exclusion of values, is setting itself up for failure. So you need a balance between the two. And I think that there's no question that from a pragmatic standpoint that you'd have to figure out through practitioners, through experience, through expertise and study, what that balance might be. The other component would be we're now in a world in which the U.S. has lost its moral standing. It's hyper-transactional. And I'm thinking beyond 2029 to the next administration. If we want to recapture our moral leadership, we need to adjust the formulation here. It cannot be purely interest-driven approach going forward. We need to be, if anything, more focused on values. We want to be able to rebuild our relationships with fellow alliances, with our fellow allies in NATO, especially because they're spending potentially 5% of their GDP in €1 trillion. If we could demonstrate that we have shared values, shared interests, shared threat perceptions, the combined resources will be much, much more effective at pushing back against the surging authoritarianism. So I think just in the interest of time, I wanted to hit the kind of the top lines here. Let me see if there's I think the other point you made, I think certainly the Bush administration, second Bush administration, and Cheney being maybe the most vocal proponent as a neoconservative. There were a lot of platitudes and rhetoric in that administration, but in terms of how they implemented their policies, with regards to Russia was, I think, an exclusion to a hard-nosed approach. I think where the administration was able to successfully flex its muscles and it was a deep miscalculation because we ended up getting caught in 20 years of war, is that we thought that middling powers and small powers were where we could actually coerce and exercise control. But by and large, with large states, which is a consistent theme, I think a theme that transcends the 20th century, goes back to the 19th century. There was more of a balance of power view. What is it that we want to how do we navigate a world with other significant powers in play? So I think if it was neoconservatism, it was applicable to small states that we thought we could coerce rather than large states that we were, maybe peripherally trying to affect those states. I don't know. Were there any other major? You asked a lot of questions.
I'm sure we can actually go on talking for longer, but to stick to the plan, we're actually out of time, and we're going to then hear from our next commentator, my colleague Daniel Bessner. Thank you. Thanks.
Dr. Vindman, thank you so much for coming to Seattle. I know we all really appreciate it. So I'm going to take a bit of a different tack than Scott. I'm going to ask a question and you can respond, and we can see what we do or don't get through it. And I'm a historian of U.S. foreign relations, so I'm going to take a bit of a step back where Scott focuses specifically on the Russia and extra-Russia region. Let's describe it that way. So the first thing I want to ask is, what is your vision of the United States' global role going forward? We're clearly in a moment of transition. The United States, of course, has dominated international politics since 1945, but things are different today. So to back up and sort of give that question context, I think it's important to appreciate what the reality of American leadership, or what some critics have called empire, actually was. So for example, the political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke has shown that during the Cold War, the United States attempted to covertly overthrow foreign regimes 65 times, and that, quote, states targeted in a covert regime change operation appear less likely to be democratic afterward and more likely to experience civil war, adverse regime changes, or human rights abuses. The historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain, for his part, has shown that 20 million people died in Cold War-era conflicts, in which the United States was at least partially involved. And then the political scientists Adita Kushi and Monica Duffy-Toft have demonstrated that between 1946 and 2019, the US intervened abroad with the threat, display, or direct usage of force 216 times, almost 3 interventions a year. So from one perspective, one could argue that while US global leadership, I think that is a euphemism, was quite good for the North Atlantic world, particularly Europe, but was quite damaging to much of the rest of the world, particularly Asia, where many of those Cold War deaths actually occurred in wars like Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere in that region. So I'm curious, what should the United States do going forward if we take what I would say a more honest accounting of what US leadership has actually meant for much of the world?
Okay, so I think I view U.S. leadership fundamentally differently. I think there is absolutely no question that during the Cold War, in what was an existential ideological struggle, the U.S. in many ways compromised itself, whether it was prosecuting, challenging communist regimes, and responding to the perception of the domino effect of communist regimes taking over the world, or precluding communist regimes from taking over Latin America and our own Western Hemisphere. Many involvements there. But by and large, in the aftermath of the Cold War, U.S. leadership, even in this existential struggle, managed to avoid large-scale wars. The kinds of large-scale wars I'm thinking are World War I and World War II, where you had millions, tens of millions of casualties, and U.S. leadership managed to structure economic relationships, incentives, suppressing its own kind of maximalist aims for a kind of more of a pluralistic notion of a greater good, and in so doing, avoided both these cataclysmic wars. I mean, in a nuclear age, a third world war would obviously be cataclysmic, and the U.S. leadership building a strong team of fellow democracies was quite critical. And then the other part of this, I'd say, is U.S. leadership with regards to advancing its values and its desire to bring democracies and fellow, and frankly just states from across the ideological spectrum in as potential partners, also massively transformed the international system from a much more brutal existence for much of the world. That didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It didn't just happen that all of a sudden, you're lifting millions and millions of people out of poverty. It happened because of U.S. leadership. It happened because U.S. was a leader in terms of innovating solutions to challenges, whether from a technological standpoint. If you take the U.S. out of the equation, we have the potential for a repeated pattern. I mean, it's a bit of a counterfactual. We know what happened. We know that we avoided massive, large-scale wars. We know that we lifted up billions of people out of poverty. And that did not happen by itself. That happened through U.S. leadership. So I guess I just approach this question from a fundamentally different perspective. I think, am I going to argue that, and I wouldn't argue it because it's just not true, that the U.S. didn't make many tragic mistakes, propping up regimes, engaging, you heard me talk about it in the last Q&A, that we stumbled into a war of choice that cost thousands of lives in the Middle East. There's no question that we seem to make the same mistakes and sometimes amplify those mistakes. But I think U.S. leadership has fundamentally been a positive force, and we are in a deeply troubling moment in which the U.S. is not displaying that kind of leadership, doesn't have a vision, doesn't even have a platitude towards kind of being a moral leader to try to have a positive effect on humanity under the Trump administration. And on the back end of this, we have to figure out how to find our way and move forward. And I think that's my fundamental kind of worldview.
No, totally, and I leave it to students to decide on which side they come out on. But just to quickly add, to give some numbers to what you just said, according to Brown's Cost of War project, almost 1 million people died due to direct war violence caused by the U.S. global war on terror, and an additional 3.6 to 3.8 million people died indirectly, for example, through famine caused by war violence. But let's go on. I do want to ask you about if the United States, and it sounds like you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, should maintain a leadership position. I think, curious what you would think about the reality of that in East Asia, which to me seems completely impossible and the artifact of a very unique world situation in which the United States in 1945 was responsible, for example, for half of the world's exports. That's just not going to be the reality any longer, and I would be surprised if the United States is even in East Asia in a serious way in 25 years. But even beyond that, let's assume that the United States maintains a leadership position. What should the criterion of engagement be, according to a neo-idealist theory?
So I'm quite comfortable in saying that the U.S. will be involved in every corner of the world, and we are in probably a moment of significant aberration with U.S. withdrawal and bent from this administration towards isolationism. I think the fact is that if we think about historically to the perceptions of, let's say, for instance, Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, that the U.S. was going to lose its place and the Japanese were going to be the largest economy, or the predictions that the Chinese economy was going to overtake the U.S. economy. I mean, you set aside the PPP calculations, the U.S. still maintains economic primacy. Now, we are almost certainly going to take a hit under Trump's trade wars.
Depends what statistics.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that the fact is that we are also part of a robust team of democracies, the aggregate of democratic power with regards to our fellow G7 economies is likely to stay unchallenged. I think the fact that we are the reserve currency, and we are that place is not likely to be challenged. It means that we can continue to, frankly, print money for the foreseeable future unless we're supplanted, and continue to engage in the same way that we have done over the course of the past decades. So I think I'm trying to figure out under what conditions. I think there's little doubt that China is accelerating its ability to exercise control in its region. It's certainly taking on policies to, restrict freedom of navigation, declare a privileged sphere of influence. It's building the military power to try to undergird that. It's potentially building the military power most dangerously for a Taiwan seizure scenario to realize a one China policy. But in terms of the U.S. and its expenditure and its ability to maintain its military power, especially if you aggregate that to the $1 trillion that the EU has declared that it wants to start to spend by 2030. I think we have 4 traditional elements of national power: military, economic, diplomatic, informational. I think from a military standpoint, that's likely to be preserved certainly the aggregate of our alliance structure. Informationally, I think we have the most robust platforms for evangelizing a democratic and U.S. view under great strain under the Trump administration. Economic, I think we have those preserving that power also. So I'm trying to figure out, what scenario would allow us to regress to the point where we're relevant, and I can't see it.
Yeah, I think China has more of an interest in Taiwan ultimately than the United States,
Sure.
but that's a conversation for a different time.
No, I agree
Just
with
two quick points. I don't really like the term isolationism because anyone who's been tarred as isolationist has always thought the United States should dominate the Western Hemisphere, and you can't really ignore Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do think if you look at long-term trends, the G7 share of global GDP has just been in decline for, at this point, decades.
Except for the U.S.
Yeah, but
The U.S. is,
well, again, it depends on
Yeah.
depends on how you count.
Yeah.
But
I mean, we're a $30 trillion economy.
yeah. Let's go to my final question. What are U.S. values, and particularly whose values, particularly in a country that has become increasingly oligarchical? If we just say we should follow U.S. values, those are the values of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. I don't think they're going to be my values. So how do you determine that?
Look, this is certainly a bit of a struggle. I think there are fundamental values that maybe there could be some consensus on. I think the fundamental idea that the prosperity and the proliferation of democratic regimes is central to U.S. security and prosperity, that we are deeply unlikely to go to war, and they're also the sources of our trade and economic prosperity. I think that's kind of central and fundamental. When you start to go down the road and the list of potential values, I don't even know I think there's not necessarily consensus outside of the democratic world on values. I mean, certainly in East Asia, those values would be different. It's not about necessarily the individuality, it's about common good. So I'm not saying that there is not kind of a tension between value sets. I think the idea is to agree on a small number of vital, what we have called traditionally vital national security interests, but vital values that allow us to focus on a long-term target and long-term good. That is really the fundamental notion that I think if we get to that, then we stop being so transactional, stop being so short-sighted. It would have a positive effect on the trajectory of choosing confrontations in the Middle East, being fair weather and inconsistent with regards to our own hemisphere and the kinds of relationships we have. I think those types of things are the biggest, broadest consensus, as opposed to going down much more peripheral values. I think that's what I'm going towards.
Thank you. I personally am more skeptical about the oligarchy's commitment to democracy, but that will be for a different time. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to welcome my colleague, Laada Bilaniuk. Thank you.
I do want to say that I completely agree with you on. I mean, there's deep concern about the direction. From just a practical standpoint of the instability in our system, a lot of that is driven by, yawning inequality and the amount of wealth concentrated, and that's not the way this country was necessarily designed. We didn't have this kind of disparity, even in the Gilded Age.
Yeah, no, it's the worst in American history.
I also don't think the oligarchy controls this country. I mean, if anything, if you're not feeling a little bit better after last night, people power. I mean, that's the speech I gave yesterday to a group of Democrats in Wisconsin. It's a demonstration of people waking up to the dangers around them, a demonstration of people power, and a tide that frankly can't be resisted, even by the oligarchy.
I hope you are correct.
I'm an
Yay,
optimist.
for holding on to optimism. Okay. Yes, so thank you very much for both the experience and ideas you shared in your books and in your talk. I'm a linguistic anthropologist. I'm not a historian, political scientist. So my first question is going to be a semantic one. I realize that realism is like the official name for a political ideology, but isn't it folly to call it realism? Because it's realistic. Why would you call it realism? So is that too much of a concession? Does it matter? Would it make just more sense to call it transactional self-interest?
Yeah.
Because it would be, so what are your thoughts?
No, I think they've got some good branding. The realists have got some really good branding. It's simple. It sounds very, very like don't you want to be realistic about the world? I've described it as an anomaly that we actually practiced anything resembling kind of doctrinal realism. I've described it more as faux realism, with the exception of, and I'm not necessarily, there are plenty of colorful figures, but Henry Kissinger was a relatively consistent, effective practitioner of realism. He was an advocate for it, and he was a practitioner. And with the exception of somebody like Kissinger, that was able to direct this country to figure out how to balance against our prime threat, which was the Soviet Union at that point in time. Everything else has been actually more like a faux realism. Practical for the moment, practical for a particular problem, without taking account of the long-term consistency required to actually fulfill a strategy, or let alone a grand strategy. So I think if we had a realist, a true practitioner of realism, maybe we would have followed Dick Cheney's prescription, shout out to him since he passed away, in which he, in 1991, when there was a debate on how to conduct ourselves with regards to Russia, how to conduct ourselves with regards to Ukraine, Dick Cheney specifically advocated for the fact that maybe Ukraine should retain a small nuclear weapon as a hedge against a resurgent Russia, a revanchist Russia. He wasn't the only one. There was a famous line from Helmut Kohl. I'm not sure I don't recall if I put it in the book, in which he seized the moment to reunify Germany in a moment of Russian weakness, understanding that Russia is a 500-year endlessly expanding empire through much of its history. So I think that under these conditions, we have a realism is more of a mirage, and it's a cult than a practical application. And I think that we have to do what we have to stay with what we work with. It's kind of the driving force behind a lot of, even on the democratic side, behind the way we conduct ourselves around the world. What I'm really looking for, and if anybody has some suggestions, neo-idealism is a little bit problematic, because idealism has got some baggage with it, and new idealism doesn't sound much better. So if there's a better name for kind of values primacy going forward, the kinds of a consistency with regard to moving towards the values that enable U.S. security and prosperity, I'll take it, but I don't have one at the moment.
Maybe
I need some of that
values
realism.
primacy,
Yeah.
although that's not an ism.
You just need, you need a word or something.
Yeah, well, I guess this is coming, I'm not sure how much it is used by practitioners outside of academia, and I think it's certainly not something that the non-political science general public uses, so coming across this title,
Yeah.
at first I was a little baffled about what that was going to be.
I almost always talk about the subtitle first, because it's easy to understand.
Yeah.
Nothing, no kind of mixed signals, and then it takes little explanation for them.
But I personally think that if you're not a realist, you should just, I don't know, call it transactionalism or something like that. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk recently about the need to decolonize academic departments in the West, generally because area studies that looked at the Slavic world, former Soviet space, was very Russian-centric, just in interest, and also sort of romanticizing Russian culture and language to completely ignoring the other non-Russian republics, not to mention all of the diversity of languages and cultures within Russia. And So I'm wondering how much of the dominant ideologies in U.S. Policymaking and military comes from ignorance about that part of the world, from the training that people have been getting, or is it not ignorance but cognizant, desire to frame things in terms of great powers?
I think it's a mix of both. Certainly, there are folks that are tethered towards realism as a practical means to navigate the challenges that the United States has. But I think it's also a healthy dose of ignorance around that part of the world. And at critical points in time, the ignorance probably was paramount. Well, certainly in the 90s, when we had no experience. We established a consulate in Ukraine just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. All the experience that we had in our government was focused on the Soviet Union, Sovietologists, and then Russia studies. So the decisions around whether these independent republics should be able to self-determine their way ahead were secondary to an understanding of Russia as kind of coherent, because in the Soviet Union you had these republics, but in the Imperial Russian period, basically Russia dominated the same countries with the same region without these republics. So people would revert back to the Russian Empire, and it was integrated all these regions. So I think it was a combination of the two, and there was also, I think, a bit of a feature of the way the U.S. conducts itself with regards to its foreign policy is easiest when you're interacting with other regional powers or significant powers. So as opposed to having to have relationships with each and every state in the international system, we like things kind of devolve down to our proxies and our relationships, and sometimes that even includes adversaries. That we might want to conduct our relationships with a region, especially in the early days, through Moscow as opposed to through the individual countries themselves. It's a feature of being a great power and liking to interact with other great powers.
Okay. I think that a couple more questions. I think we might have time for them. So could you talk a little bit more about the challenges of being a practitioner, both military and diplomatic, versus the academic side of your experience? And what advice do you have for students who, and other scholars who are looking at military conflicts but don't have that military?
I appreciate that question. I think my entire professional career was centered around practice. So I feel a little bit like a bit of an imposter in academic settings. Trying to, I think this is the second time I've done this kind of format where I presented the book and there was an interaction. So it's interesting. So to me, when I look at problems, I think about not just kind of theoretical solutions, but pragmatic and practical solutions. And that's why heuristics, based on my experience, as a way to kind of govern the way we look at different challenges, become quite important to me. This calculation about resources, risk, stake in problems, because we have limited resources, we can't be everywhere all at once. I think these types of things come out of practice, and that's why I would encourage the young folks in here to not just think about academia, even if you choose that as your course. I think a segue into practice somewhere along the way could be very, very healthy. My cousin, she's a professor at Johns Hopkins now in arms control and international relations. She spent, under the Biden administration, she spent about 3 years in government, and I think it makes her a better academic also. There's also something to be said, and maybe this is part of my career as a younger infantryman. I did a lot of postings forward, getting a tactile feel for different issues. Spent one of the best periods in my career was when the U.S. government gave me about $60,000 and said, hey, go live in Ukraine, go travel all throughout the region, get an understanding of that part of the world, what U.S. interests are in the region, the cultures. I think getting a tactile feel for problems by being on the ground and not just studying them remotely is absolutely essential. It's the way I think about everything is like, I don't really understand something unless I'm interacting with it directly.
So you were a bit of an anthropologist then, actually. Yeah.
I'll take it.
So, and last, I'll end up with more of a personal question. And in your first book, I know you share a lot about your upbringing. And this relates to this question about lack of knowledge about anything other than Russia. So for me, certainly growing up, people would use Soviet and Russia as the same thing. People thought that Ukraine or the other countries, isn't that part of Russia? So I was curious when, since you came to this country very young, when did you first learn that there's a difference between Ukraine and Russia, and how did the Soviet concept fit into that? So
I would say relatively late. I grew up thinking of myself as a Russian Jewish kid. I think that the Russian narratives around Ukraine and Russian narratives around itself are that Russia was a friend to the Jewish people, and that Ukraine was, a collaborator with the Nazis. That is a very self-serving, and the first chapter in this book actually talks about some of those narratives that Russia tells about itself. That it's the historical center for that part of the world. Russia and its predecessor Moscow didn't exist for hundreds of years, while Kiev and Rus was the regional heavyweight. So I think, until I actually started studying this and understood that Russia was critical to establishing a Pale of Settlement, that Russia drove some of the pogroms to expropriate resources from the Jewish population, that the reason that it wasn't just the Ukrainians, Jews that came here as refugees. It was Russian and Soviet Jews, because it was deep anti-Semitism against the entire population. And what was fascinating about this is that it's in learning this history and studying this and having this immersion, I understand better the community that my parents live in, and that a lot of the kind of more homogenous communities that are speaking really to themselves on the narrative that Russia's told them. My mother, when she read this book, she was like, this is not what we were taught in Soviet schools about Russian history. So now I think part of the privilege of being able to go and interact with people is to share that things were not quite as simple as it seemed. Even we could go down a rabbit hole, so I'll leave it there. But I undertook a kind of a concerted effort to try to understand my history, and who doesn't want to be kind of a badass Russian or Ukrainian Jewish guy now? So just like Zelensky.
on that note, thank you very much.